The call came at 11:47 on a Thursday morning, and Nora Montoya took it standing in the parking lot of a Dollar General on North High Street in Columbus, holding a $9 bottle of laundry detergent she hadn't yet decided to buy. The number on her screen had a Byers Creek, Indiana area code. She hadn't dialed it in 8 months. She answered. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Beverly Creel, her mother's next-door neighbor of 37 years. Beverly's voice had the careful, measured quality of someone who had been rehearsing what she would say since the moment she picked up her own phone. "Honey," Beverly said, and Nora already knew. Delia Montoya died on the night of April 29th or the early hours of April 30th, alone in the house on Sycamore Lane where she had lived since 1979. She was 76 years old. Beverly had noticed the kitchen light burning through the night and had called the Byers Creek Police Department at 6:40 that morning. They found Delia in her recliner in the living room, as if she'd sat down to rest and simply hadn't gotten back up. Cardiac arrest, the paramedics said. Almost certainly fast. Nora put the laundry detergent back on the shelf. She drove home to her apartment on Thurber Drive and sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that went cold while she held it. There were practical things to do, a list forming in her head whether she wanted it to or not. The school to call, arrangements to make, a car to pack, a 300-mile drive she hadn't made in 8 months. She sat there instead and thought about the last conversation she'd had with her mother. August. She'd called asking for money. Not much, by the standards of people who had it. Enough to cover 3 overdue car payments while Kevin contested a clause in the divorce settlement and her attorney needed a retainer that Nora didn't have. She'd worked through the list of people she could ask and reached the end of it and called Delia. Her mother had said she was sorry. She didn't have anything to give. Nora had said something she regretted within 30 seconds of saying it. Something about having known better than to ask. She'd hung up without letting Delia respond. 8 months of silence had followed. Neither of them called back. That was what she was going to have to live with now. The silence had become the last word between them, and there was no undoing it. She'd met Kevin Harris in her second year of teaching at Franklin Middle School in Columbus, where she taught 7th grade art. They'd been married 11 years, the last 4 of which had been an extended argument neither of them could find a way to end. The divorce was finalized the previous February, and what it left behind was a woman 41 years old, starting from roughly nothing, in an apartment that cost too much on a salary that paid too little, with a Honda that had 143,000 miles on it, and a radiator the Firestone mechanic had described, in writing, as showing imminent failure risk. She was 12 days from her next paycheck and 3 months behind on rent, and Kevin had stopped returning her calls about the alimony arrangement their lawyers had formalized in a courthouse conference room that smelled like stale coffee. She had not asked her mother for money before that August phone call in all 11 years of her marriage. She'd told herself it was because she was independent, that she was managing. She'd told herself a lot of things the August call had made difficult to keep believing. She left Columbus the next morning with a bag in the back seat and a box of garbage bags for clearing out her mother's belongings. 300 miles through Ohio farmland going gray-green in the last days of April, and then Indiana, flat and open, the highway cutting through fields that had been plowed but not yet planted, the sky pale and cloudless and cold. She stopped once for gas and a coffee she didn't finish and was back on the highway before she'd decided she was ready to be. Byers Creek announced itself the way it always had. The water tower first, on the south edge of town, the seal painted on the side and faded now from 15 years of weather. Then the grain elevator beside the tracks, and then the 4-way stop at Meridian and Main where a CVS had replaced the hardware store sometime in the late 90s and where nothing much else had changed. The Kellner manufacturing site 2 blocks south of Main was an 18-acre vacant lot behind a chain-link fence, the way it had been since the plant closed in 1994, 30 years of weeds and broken concrete that nobody had found a use for. 2 restaurants on Main had closed in the past 5 years. A dollar store had opened. The kind of changes that added up to something nobody in a place like this wanted to name directly. Nora drove through without stopping and turned onto Sycamore Lane. The street was 2 blocks off Main, a row of older houses, craftsman bungalows and small 2-stories from the 1940s, built when Kellner was expanding, and the town had reason to expect more of itself than it eventually became. Most were kept up. Some were not. The maple in front of 617 Sycamore had grown enormous over the 45 years her mother had lived there, and it threw the whole front of the house into shadow, even in mid-morning. Even in late April when the leaves were barely out. She pulled into the driveway and turned off the car and sat. The house was a 1942 Craftsman bungalow with white aluminum siding that had been going gray at the edges for years, black shutters, a concrete porch with a metal railing her father had installed in 1986, and never painted. The railing was beginning to rust at the joints. The flower beds along the porch were empty. Her mother had kept them planted every April without exception for as long as Nora could remember. Purple and yellow pansies first, then whatever followed. The empty beds registered as wrong, the way small absences in a well-known place always do, and it took Nora a moment to understand why. Delia had been too sick this last spring to put flowers in. The spare key she'd found in her own things, on a yellow lanyard Delia had given her years ago for emergencies, let her through the front door without difficulty. The house smelled the way it always had. A particular combination of the soap her mother used and the cedar lining of the front closet, and something else underneath both of those things, something clean and faintly sharp, like the inside of a watch case. Nora stood in the front hallway for a moment with the door still open at her back, just breathing it. The living room was neat. Delia had always kept things neat. The recliner had been moved aside by the paramedics, pushed toward the window, and beside it a small walnut end table still held a glass of water with a dried mineral ring around the rim and a library book lying face down to hold the page. A mystery novel, two-thirds finished by the placement of the improvised bookmark. Nora picked it up and looked at the cover and set it back down. Someone would need to return it. She made herself walk through the ground floor. The kitchen was unchanged from her last visit. The same yellow curtains on the window above the sink. The same set of ceramic canisters lined up on the counter beside the coffee maker. The same linoleum from 1982 that her mother had kept so clean for 42 years it had worn to its backing in a strip in front of the sink. On the windowsill, a row of small succulents in clay pots, still alive. Someone had been watering them, or they were the kind that didn't need much. And beside the refrigerator, next to the door to the basement stairs, the padlock. Heavy, matte black, a master brand rated at industrial strength, mounted through the door the way it had been mounted for as long as Nora could remember. Exactly as she had always known it to be. She had never been in the basement. That fact had defined her entire childhood in a way she recognized only looking backward. The door was an ordinary interior door, white-painted wood, hinged like any other door in the house. What made it different was the padlock, and the padlock was not the kind you bought when you wanted privacy. It was the kind you bought when you were serious about keeping something secured. When Nora was 3 or 4 years old, she had tried to follow her mother down those stairs. The door had swung shut fast enough to catch the tips of her fingers. It wasn't a hard catch, not enough to injure her, but she had cried for 20 minutes from the shock of it. After that, she simply understood. She'd asked about it over the years, at intervals, with the persistence that forbidden things generate in children who have nothing else to do with their curiosity. Delia's answer was always the same, delivered without hesitation or visible discomfort. Water damage, years ago. The floor isn't safe. Nothing worth seeing down there anyway. The answer worked on the surface and failed below it. The basement didn't smell of damp. The furnace sat in the utility closet on the main floor, which wasn't typical, but which her mother had explained once by saying the previous owners had moved it. She could sometimes hear her mother in the evenings, after dinner, moving around beneath the floor of the living room. Footsteps on wooden stairs. The scrape of something being shifted. A door closing softly. The way you close a door when you're trying not to be heard. She'd mentioned it to her best friend Angela in 7th grade. Angela had suggested marijuana. A boy named Jeff from her class had proposed a body. These theories had the satisfying shock of middle school speculation and no foundation in reality whatsoever, and eventually Nora stopped mentioning it. The subject calcified into something that simply was, the way certain things become in a household, unremarked on, accepted, part of the permanent geography of the place. She went upstairs. Her mother's bedroom was orderly with the precision of someone who had made her bed with tight corners every morning for 50 years. The double bed. The dresser with the oval mirror. A small ceramic figure of the Virgin on one corner of the dresser, a comb and hand mirror laid parallel to each other beside it. On the nightstand, a photograph of Nora at her college graduation in 1999, and beside it, smaller, a photograph she hadn't seen before. She picked it up. Her parents, on what had to be their wedding day. 1975 or 76 by the look of the clothes. Outside a church she didn't recognize. Her father was 24 years old and had the expression of a young man who has made a decision he's glad of and slightly afraid of simultaneously. Her mother was 23, her hair down past her shoulders, wearing a dress that looked like it might have been made by someone who understood construction. Delia's expression in the photograph was the same composed, careful expression she had worn for every moment of Nora's memory of her. But there was something around her eyes in the photograph, some quality of aliveness, that the later Delia had trained away over the years. Ernesto Montoya had worked at Kellner Manufacturing until the plant closed in '94. He was a quiet man, steady in his routines, not unkind, not particularly present in the way that mattered. When Kellner moved its operations to Mexico and the jobs went with them, Ernesto took a position with a Kellner subsidiary in Indianapolis and drove home on weekends for a while, and then on alternate weekends, and then irregularly, and then not at all. He met a woman named Patricia in Indianapolis. He sent money for about a year, and then progressively less until he sent nothing. He and Patricia moved to Phoenix sometime after the millennium, and as far as Nora knew, he was still there. Delia had not appeared broken by it. She'd gone full-time at Thatcher Fine Jewelry on Main Street, where she'd worked part-time since 1981, and she'd kept the house and raised Nora through middle school and high school with the quiet, undemonstrative determination of a woman who had decided what she owed her child and was going to deliver it without being asked. Gerald Thatcher was a precise man from Decatur who had opened the jewelry shop in 1974. He was not warm and was not unkind, and he expected his employees to be excellent at their work without requiring excessive management. He had hired Delia because she was exceptional with fine motor work. He kept her for 22 years because she was the best repair specialist he had ever encountered. She could resize a ring in 20 minutes without leaving a tool mark. She could clean a pocket watch that hadn't run in 30 years and have it ticking by afternoon. She could look at a piece of jewelry and tell within a few minutes where it was made, approximately when, and what it was likely to be worth, with a reliability that most credentialed gemologists arrived at only with instruments. Gerald knew this about her and paid her accordingly, which in practice meant 15% above his salespeople, and a figure she never argued about, because the work itself was what she cared about. The shop closed in 2003 when Gerald turned 68 and retired to Fort Myers, Florida. He died of a stroke 2 years later and left his affairs in order and his fishing equipment to a nephew. On the last day of the shop, he had given Delia her severance check, a letter of recommendation she never used, and a cardboard box. The box held 41 pieces that customers had dropped off for repair and never come back for. Some went back 20 years. The oldest was a pocket watch left by a man whose forwarding address was no longer good, in 1983. Gerald told Delia to do something with them or throw them out, whatever seemed right. He didn't want the legal complication. She thanked him, carried the box to the trunk of the Buick, and drove home. She carried it downstairs. Nora had known none of this. She was in Columbus in 2003, teaching her second year at Franklin, beginning the relationship with Kevin Harris that would eventually take 11 years to fully resolve. She called home at holidays and came back when she could manage it. She had no idea what was happening in the basement on Sycamore Lane. She had stopped wondering about it years ago. She went to the sewing room at the end of the upstairs hall. This was the room that looked most like Delia. A professional Bernina machine on its own table, a cutting board on the main surface, spools of thread arranged by color family on a pegboard wall, pattern paper rolled and stored in a labeled bin by the door. 40 years of private alterations work, visible in the wear on the cutting surface and the organized precision of everything stored. On the work table, 2 unfinished pieces, a pair of wool trousers with a hem half-pinned, a women's jacket with a zipper replacement started and stopped halfway through. Someone's clothes. Someone who didn't know yet that they were never going to be picked up. She went back downstairs. Daniel Pruitt arrived at noon in a gray sedan. He was in his early 60s, trim, gray-haired. with the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades delivering complicated news to people who hadn't asked for it, and had learned the particular skill of taking his time without making people feel they were being managed. He shook her hand on the porch and came inside, and they sat at the kitchen table, the same table Nora had done 12 years of homework at, its surface worn smooth in the places where elbows had rested. He laid the estate documents out in sections. The house was owned outright, mortgage paid off in 2011, a savings account holding $9,040. No credit card balances, no outstanding debts. The house and all its contents passed to Nora as sole heir. The property was appraised last October, Pruitt said. Current market for this neighborhood runs between $82,000 and $91,000. 87 is a realistic midpoint for a sale in reasonable time. The house needs cosmetic work, but the structure is sound. Nora was doing the arithmetic without appearing to. $87,000 against back rent. The car, the credit card balance she'd been carrying for 2 years, the outstanding legal fees from the divorce. She'd come out with roughly $55,000. Enough to start over. Not enough to feel any different than she'd felt for the past 2 years, which was the specific anxiety of someone who was always counting toward a number that kept moving. There's something else, Pruitt said. He set an envelope on the table between them. Standard letter size, white, her name written across the front in Delia's small, precise cursive, the handwriting of a woman who had kept up her penmanship as a matter of personal discipline long after anyone stopped requiring it. Your mother brought this to me 14 months ago, Pruitt said, when she received her diagnosis. She asked me to hold it and to deliver it to you personally, in this house, before you made any decisions about the property. Her exact words, before you make any decisions. Nora looked at the envelope. She was sick for 14 months and didn't tell me. She asked me not to contact you. She said she would find the right time to tell you herself. And the right time never came. Pruitt didn't answer. She picked up the envelope. The paper was heavier than regular stationery. She turned it over. No seal, nothing theatrical, just tape applied neatly and her name. I'll read it tonight, she said. Pruitt left her with his card and the estate folder and told her to call when she was ready to proceed. Beverly Creel came by at 4 o'clock with a foil-covered casserole and the particular competent kindness of a woman in her 70s who understood, from long experience, what people needed at hard moments and didn't wait to be asked. She was sharp-eyed and white-haired, and she had the slightly relieved manner of someone who had been watching the house next door for months and was glad someone was finally in it. She sat on the end of the sofa in the living room and told Nora about the winter. Delia had slowed down in January. Beverly had noticed first because Delia stopped hanging laundry on the back line, something she'd done year-round in all weather for as long as Beverly had lived next door. Then in February, she stopped walking to the post office and asked Beverly to collect her mail. In March, she said she was tired and that the medication was making her feel lousy. She was working, though, Beverly said. That last month especially. She'd go down to that basement after supper almost every night. I could see the light through the little windows on the side of the house, the ones at ground level that look out onto the driveway. 9, 10 o'clock at night, the light would still be on down there. Did she say what she was doing? I never asked. Beverly smoothed the fabric of her slacks in the absent way of someone choosing words. With your mother, there were territories. You learned them and you respected them, and you didn't ask. It wasn't that she was cold. She wasn't cold. She was one of the most genuinely reliable people I've ever lived beside. If I was sick, she appeared at the door with food. If I was away, she checked my house twice a day without me asking. But she kept herself to herself in a way that was complete, and every person on this street understood it and made their peace with it. Nora thought about her own childhood, about the way that completeness had felt from the inside of it, from the position of a child in the house. Beverly had one specific memory she offered carefully, as if she'd been deciding whether to share it for some time. The winter after Ernesto left, which would have been 1995, a young woman named Teresa had moved into the house 3 doors down with 2 small children. There had been some situation, Beverly said, and then stopped and said only that Teresa had needed help, the kind that didn't involve calling anyone official. For 3 months, groceries had appeared on Teresa's porch twice a week, and her car had been moved out of the driveway on the nights when someone needed it moved, and nobody on the street ever discussed who was responsible because nobody needed to. That was your mother, Beverly said. Nobody announced it. Nobody knew officially. But we all knew. She mentioned Chad Mercer the way you mentioned something you've been waiting for an opening to bring up. He was a developer out of Fort Wayne who had been acquiring properties on this block for 2 years, working toward a mixed-use project he'd named Byers Creek Commons. Retail on the ground level, apartments above, the standard development formula for small-town Main Street corridors. The city had given preliminary approval. He needed contiguous ownership of the parcels between Sycamore and Elm to make the project footprint work. He'd gotten 6 of the 8 houses on the block. Older residents, mostly, Beverly said, people in their late 70s and 80s on fixed incomes, people who couldn't afford to turn down money above market value. Delia had turned him down 3 times. He came to the porch 3 times that I personally witnessed, Beverly said. Once in 2022 and twice in 2023. She didn't let any of them pass the front step. I don't know what she said to him, but he didn't stay long, and he didn't look happy when he left. Beverly took the casserole instructions with her when she went. She forgot the casserole. Chad Mercer arrived at 6:55, 10 minutes after Beverly left. He was 44, medium height, with the kind of easy, practiced polish that announced a certain category of ambition before he said a word. He shook her hand on the porch and expressed condolences in a way that was brief and genuine enough not to be offensive. And then he said he'd been hoping to speak with her mother about a development opportunity, and he was sorry the conversation had never happened, and he understood this was a difficult time, and he valued being direct. The project was on a schedule. The schedule required this parcel. He was in a position to offer considerably above market value, and he named it $140,000, cash, 30-day close. Nora ran the arithmetic without letting it show on her face. $53,000 more than the open market would give her. The difference between starting over barely and starting over with some margin. She looked at him and said she'd just arrived and would need time to consider it. Of course. He produced a card. Heavy stock, embossed type. I understand completely, but I do need to know by Friday morning. If this parcel isn't coming into the project, I need to restructure some things, and I'd rather know sooner. Friday was 3 days away. The framing was friendly, and the mechanics were a deadline designed to prevent serious thought. She took the card and said she'd be in touch and went back inside. She stood in the kitchen with his card in one hand and looked at the basement door. $140,000. By this time next month the house would be sold, the lot cleared, the foundation poured for whatever Chad Mercer intended to build over the place where her mother had lived for 45 years. Delia had said no to that 3 times. She didn't sleep well. The house had the particular nighttime voice of old houses, a constant low-level conversation of wood and pipes, and the settling sound of old joists, and she lay in her old room for 2 hours before giving up and going downstairs. She sat in the recliner in the living room in the dark and tried to think about nothing useful and failed. She picked up the library book from the end table and held it without reading it, and then noticed the bookmark. It wasn't a proper bookmark. It was a photograph, the home printer kind on regular paper, slightly curled at the corners from being handled. It showed a small girl, 6 years old or so, sitting at some kind of workbench, watching intently as a woman's hands performed an operation just outside the frame of the picture. The girl was Nora. The hands were Delia's. The workbench was not in the kitchen. It was lower than the kitchen table, darker wood, and around the edges of the photograph, she could see tool handles and small items laid out in a row. The photograph had been taken from below, from the bottom of a staircase. She turned it over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting. The first time I let you watch. The last time, too. I'm sorry about that. She sat with that for a long time. Morning came gray and then cleared. She made coffee in her mother's kitchen in her mother's coffee maker, measured with the same small spoon Delia had used in the ceramic canister beside the machine, and she sat down at the kitchen table with the sealed envelope and opened it. 6 pages of lined notebook paper, front and back. Her mother's handwriting compressed slightly from what she remembered, as if the illness had tightened it. Nora, I've started this letter 4 times and thrown it away 4 times. That should tell you something about what kind of woman you come from, though you already know. I've never been good at saying what I mean when what I mean is something that matters. I was diagnosed 14 months ago with congestive heart failure. They say I could have several years if I'm careful, or considerably less if I'm not. I've tried to be careful because there are things I need to finish before I go. I should have called you when they told me. I want you to know that I know that. I'm writing it down because I want you to understand I'm not under any illusion about it. When your father left, I made certain decisions about myself. I decided I would not ask for help. I decided I would not show what I had or what I didn't have. I decided I would not be the kind of person who could be owed or pitted or controlled by owing. I was very certain about these decisions for a long time, then less certain. By the time I was old enough to understand what they had cost us both, it seemed too late to do anything but keep going. The basement. Let me tell you about the basement. When Gerald Thatcher closed the shop in 2003, he gave me a box. 41 pieces that customers had left for repair and never claimed, some of them going back 20 years. He said do something with them or throw them out. He didn't want the complication. I couldn't throw them out. Some of them were old, genuinely old, from families who might not know they had anything remaining. I carried the box downstairs. That box was where it started. I had watched pieces come through Thatcher's for 22 years. I knew what things were worth. I also knew what people did not know they had. When estate sales happened in this county, and they happen regularly because this is the kind of place where old people die and leave things to children who live far away and need the money quickly, I began going. Not to buy everything. To buy what I recognized. What I could put a date and a name to and document. I kept records from the first acquisition. Every piece I bought. The date, the price I paid, where it came from, what I believed it to be, and on what basis. I have 43 composition notebooks in the basement, one per year for the years I was working from home, going back to 2003. Every piece has documentation. I am particular about documentation. It was the most important thing Gerald ever taught me. Though he didn't intend to teach it, he just kept meticulous records himself, and I watched him do it for 22 years. I want to tell you what's in that room. I find I can't do it in words. Words won't let you understand what 21 years of careful work looks like in a space. You need to see it. What I can tell you is the number. Daniel Pruitt arranged for an appraiser from Indianapolis, a man named Robert Vale who specializes in estate jewelry and vintage timepieces. He came last October, while the leaves were still on. He spent 4 hours in the basement. When he came upstairs, he sat down at this table and said to me in a very careful voice, the voice of a professional who has learned to deliver surprising things without inflection. The collection is worth between $6.8 and $8.2 million. I said I know. I didn't fully know. I had estimates. My own estimates I'd revised at intervals over the years, but I hadn't tracked the total closely. When you're building something piece by piece over a long time, adding one thing and then another, the sum can get away from you. When he said that number, I understood that it had gotten away from me considerably. He said the vintage watch collection alone would bring more than the house at auction. He said there were 3 individual pieces he believed belonged in museum permanent collections. He said the documentation I'd kept was exceptional and would make everything considerably simpler. Nora, the collection belongs to you. Everything in that room. I built it for you, though I understand that you didn't know that. And I never told you. And the distance between us grew while I was downstairs working on something you had no knowledge of. I have thought about that distance for years. I have not known how to close it. When you called me last August, I almost told you. I almost said, come to Byers Creek, I have something to show you. But I couldn't hand it to you in pieces. The collection needs to be handled properly, documented, appraised, transferred through the right channels, and 14 months ago none of that was finished. I told myself I'd finish and then I'd call. I kept thinking there would be a right time. I understand now that there is not a right time for something like this. There was no version of telling you that was going to be simple or unawkward or without everything underneath it. I waited for a condition that didn't exist. I'm sorry for that. I'm particularly sorry for August. You called me for help and I said I didn't have anything to give. That was the truest lie I have ever told. I am not going to call it anything other than wrong. I have one request. It is only a request, not a condition on any of it. There is a woman named Elena Marchetti who lives on Elm Street, 2 blocks north of here. She is 83 years old. In 1989, she brought a brooch to Thatcher's for repair. Her grandmother's piece, made in Venice in 1897, 2 small rubies in gold filigree, a pattern of seed pearls along the setting. She paid the deposit and came back 6 months later. By then, Gerald had moved the shop to the new location and the brooch had been lost in the transition. He refunded her deposit. For Gerald, that was the end of it. I found the brooch 14 years later in a storage bin Gerald had never properly unpacked after the move. I recognized it from the repair ticket From the description I had written in my own handwriting, because I was the one who had taken Elena Marchetti's order in 1989. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. I had a very clear memory of the piece. That brooch is in the top drawer of the steel cabinet in the basement, in a small velvet box with her name on the label. It is not part of the collection. It does not belong to the collection. It belongs to Elena Marchetti or her family. Please make sure she gets it. That is everything I am asking. Everything else is yours. I love you more than I knew how to say when you were standing in front of me. I hope you can believe that, even now, even after everything. Mom. Nora set the letter down on the table with both hands, pressing it flat against the surface. The kitchen was ordinary and bright in the morning light coming through the yellow curtains. She could hear the neighbor's lawnmower starting somewhere. A car went past on Sycamore. The succulents on the windowsill were still alive. Small things continuing to exist in the world, indifferent to what had just happened at the kitchen table. She sat without moving for a long time. Then she stood and went to the kitchen drawer below the counter to the left of the sink, the drawer where her mother had always kept miscellaneous keys and rubber bands and the odd battery, and she found what she was looking for almost immediately. A small key on a plastic ring. A handwritten tag attached to the ring. The word basement in Delia's precise cursive. She called Daniel Pruitt at 9:30. He answered on the second ring. I read the letter, she said. Yes. She mentioned an appraiser. Robert Vale. From Indianapolis. I'd recommend reaching out to him independently, regardless of what you find. His October assessment was thorough, but you should have your own evaluation. I want to open the basement. A brief pause. I can be there in 20 minutes. I'd strongly recommend having a witness when you go in for the first time. She waited in the kitchen. She did not stand in front of the basement door. She made more coffee and stood at the counter looking out at the backyard, at the clothesline her mother hadn't used since January, the 2 wooden posts holding a line with nothing on it, the small vegetable patch along the back fence left unplanted and overtaken by whatever the surrounding lot had decided to send over. Pruitt arrived in 19 minutes. He came in without ceremony, nodded at the kitchen, looked at the padlock on the door beside the refrigerator with an expression that gave nothing away, and stood with his hands in his coat pockets. She put the key in the padlock. It turned with almost no resistance. 21 years of use had kept the mechanism clean and smooth. The shackle opened. She pulled the lock free and set it on the counter and opened the door. The staircase was original to the house, 1942, narrow wooden treads without carpet, the kind built for function rather than appearance. She reached for the pull string she expected to find hanging from a bare bulb and found instead a mounted switch on the left wall, just inside the door frame. She flipped it. What came on below her was not a bare bulb. A grid of overhead LED panels, cool white, flooded the full length and width of the basement with even, bright, shadowless light. Nora stood on the top stair holding the railing with both hands and looked down. The basement was not damaged. It was not damp or dark or the ruin of something abandoned. It was a room that had been designed and constructed and maintained over 2 decades by someone who knew precisely what she was building and why. The floor was sealed concrete, swept absolutely clean, without a grain of grit or a footprint of dust. Along 3 walls, floor to ceiling, ran custom-built shelving units with glass front doors, each section fitted with its own interior lighting that activated on motion sensors as Nora descended the stairs. The shelves were lined with dark blue velvet, and resting against that velvet, in individual mounts and stands and slots, were pieces. Hundreds of pieces. More than Nora could count by looking. She walked down the stairs slowly. The wood was solid. Under her feet, each tread tight in its housing. No give anywhere. Delia had built this right. The first shelving unit to the left of the staircase held rings. They were mounted in individual velvet slots on a slanted display board, sorted by metal type and then by era. Yellow gold, white gold, platinum, a section of silver. Some were plain bands, and some were set with stones that held the light differently at different angles, catching it in the particular way of old-cut diamonds. Not the uniform brilliance of modern cutting, but something more complex, more varied. She leaned close to read one of the small handwritten labels attached to each mount with a wire loop. Gold, yellow, size 7. Art Deco, circa 1928. Diamond center stone, old European cut, approximately 0.8 carats. Set with 4-channel set baguettes. Acquired from estate of Dorothy Harkins, Meridian County, Indiana, March 2011. Beside the rings, a second unit held brooches pinned to velvet panels, each with its own label in the same small handwriting. Beyond those, on a third unit, were necklaces and earrings in their individual velvet slots, some of them clearly old enough to be pre-First World War, some more recent, all of them labeled with the same consistent information. Across the room, mounted to the far wall in a glass front cabinet with its own lock, were the watches. 2 full shelves. Pocket watches on individual stands, cases open to show the movement, dials facing out. Wristwatches laid flat in rows on velvet, each with its label. She recognized one of the wristwatch faces from somewhere she couldn't immediately place, a black dial with a particular architecture she'd seen in a magazine photograph once. She didn't know what it was worth. Whatever the number was, she suspected it was the kind of number that required a phone call to establish. The smell of the room was dry and clean, not storage smell, but preservation smell, the specific quality of controlled air. In the far right corner, a wall-mounted climate control unit hummed at a low, constant frequency. She hadn't heard it from upstairs. The machine had been running down here, keeping the temperature and humidity stable, for years. In the opposite corner stood a fireproof steel cabinet, for drawers, the kind rated for documents and small valuables. Beside it, a wooden desk, small and practical, with an adjustable lamp and a row of composition notebooks on a narrow shelf above the surface. She counted them without meaning to. 20. Labeled on their spines in black marker, 1 year each, beginning 2003 and running to last year. 20 years of records, in her mother's handwriting, in a basement that Nora had been told held nothing but water damage and a floor that wasn't safe. Daniel Pruitt stood at the base of the stairs with his hands still in his coat pockets. His expression was the expression of a man who had known approximately what was here and had still not been fully prepared for the reality of being in the room with it. He said nothing. Nora crossed to the steel cabinet and opened the top drawer. Inside, standing upright in labeled sections, were rows of glassine envelopes, the clear archival kind used in libraries and museum storage. Each envelope held something small and had a handwritten insert visible through the front face. She pulled one out. The label read, "Diamond, round brilliant, old European cut, approximately 0.6 carats. Visual and loop grade VS1. Acquired from estate of Margaret Hensley, Byers Creek, November 2007. She held it up to the overhead light. Inside the envelope, catching and breaking the light, a small diamond sat on a folded square of white paper. Margaret Hensley. Nora knew that name. An elderly woman from Walnut Street who had died sometime around 2007 without children in the area. She'd heard it mentioned peripherally, the way you hear names in small towns, without attaching much to them. Her mother had gone to that estate sale and bought this stone and written down exactly where it came from. She opened the desk drawer and took out the 2003 notebook, the first one. The first page was titled Gerald's Box, and below it, numbered, 41 descriptions, each in the same careful notation as the velvet label tags, though longer, more detailed. Ring, gold, yellow, size 6.5, set with one oval sapphire approximately 1 carat. Minor abrasions to girdle. Good condition overall. Repair ticket number absent. Customer name unknown. Estimated date of drop-off based on style and ticket form, 1984 to 1988. Every piece traced back as far as it could be traced. Every limitation on the tracing acknowledged. Every gap in the record documented as a gap. Nora set the notebook down on the desk and sat in the chair. The room was quiet around her. No sound from upstairs, no sound from the street. Only the climate control unit humming at the same low constant frequency, keeping the air exactly where Delia had set it to be kept, still maintaining the work after the woman who designed it was gone. $6.8 to $8.2 million. In the basement of a 1942 Craftsman bungalow on Sycamore Lane in Byers Creek, Indiana. Built one acquisition at a time, one estate sale at a time, one composition notebook at a time, for 21 years. By a woman who had clipped grocery coupons and worn the same coat for 9 winters and driven a Buick until it died and then walked to the post office. By a woman who said she didn't have anything to give. Nora stayed in the chair until her legs stopped shaking. Then she stood and went back to the steel cabinet and opened the top drawer again and went through the glassine envelopes until she found what she was looking for. Not an envelope, but a small velvet box, dark blue, wedged into the front corner of the drawer. The label was different from the others, a slightly older tag, the card gone faintly yellow at the edges. E. Marchetti. Brooch, Venetian, 1897. Not for sale. Returned to owner. She opened the box. The brooch inside was smaller than she'd imagined. 2 rubies, deeply red, each about the size of a small pea, set in gold filigree worked into a vine pattern, with seed pearls placed individually along the tendrils of the design. More than 125 years old, and every single pearl was still in its setting, undisturbed, exactly where the craftsman in Venice had placed them in 1897. It was a quiet, personal thing. The kind of object that meant very little to anyone who didn't know its history and meant everything to the person who did. Her mother had found it in 2017. She had kept it in this drawer for 7 years, waiting for the right moment to return it. The same way she'd been waiting for the right moment to tell Nora what was in this room. Nora closed the box carefully. She looked at Pruitt, who had not moved from the base of the stairs. "I'm not selling the house," she said. He nodded, as if this had not surprised him. "I need Robert Vale's contact information. I have it. And Elena Marchetti's address. I know who she is. I can get it for you." Nora held the velvet box in both hands and looked one more time at the room her mother had built. At the rows of glass front cases, the velvet-lined shelves, the composition notebooks standing in their row on the shelf above the desk, 20 years of documentation that her mother had kept with the same discipline she'd brought to everything else in her life. At the climate control unit, still running in the corner, she thought about Delia going down these stairs every evening in that last month. She thought about the light Beverly had seen through the ground-level windows at 9 and 10 o'clock at night. She thought about a woman who was dying, who knew she was dying, who had spent her final weeks finishing something, making sure it would be in order when she was gone. She thought about August, about calling from Columbus for help and hearing, "I don't have anything to give." She didn't have a name yet for everything she was feeling about that. There was grief in it, and something harder than grief, and something that was going to take more time than she had right now to understand fully. Her mother had loved her in the only way Delia Montoya had known how to love anyone, at a distance, in the form of something built and kept and not yet spoken of, shaped over 21 years into a fortune that Nora hadn't known existed. It was not the love Nora had needed when she needed it. It was not the call back in August. It was not the phone call 14 months ago when the diagnosis came. It was not any of the conversations they hadn't found a way to have in the years the silence between them had grown. But it was real. It was sitting in a room beneath the linoleum floor Nora had walked on her entire childhood, waiting. She climbed the stairs back into the kitchen. She left the padlock on the counter and the basement door standing open, and she picked up her phone and dialed Chad Mercer's number from his business card. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "This is Nora Montoya. I'm calling about my mother's house on Sycamore Lane. I want to let you know that the property is not for sale. It won't be for sale. I'm sorry for the inconvenience to your project." She ended the call before he could respond. Then she put on her coat and picked up the velvet box with Elena Marchetti's name on it and asked Pruitt for the address on Elm Street. She had somewhere to be. Elm Street was exactly 2 blocks north of Sycamore, and Nora walked it in the kind of morning that made Indiana feel like it had been apologizing all winter and was finally getting around to making good on it. The air was cold, but the sun was strong, catching the front windows of the houses she passed and turning them briefly to mirrors. She had the velvet box in her coat pocket with her hand closed around it. Pruitt had given her the number, 617 Elm Street, the same house number as her mother's, 2 blocks north. A small coincidence she turned over in her mind for half a block before setting it aside. Elena Marchetti's house was a Cape Cod, white with green shutters, smaller than most on the street, and older looking in the way of houses whose owners have always kept them maintained but never renovated. The front garden had tulips coming up along the walk in 2 neat rows, red and yellow, planted in the fall by someone who expected to see them. Nora stood at the end of the walk for a moment before going up. She knocked. The woman who came to the door was small and slightly bent at the shoulders, wearing a cardigan over a floral blouse, white hair pinned with precision. Her eyes were very blue, and they assessed Nora in a single careful look before anything was said. "I don't get strangers on a Friday morning," Elena Marchetti said. "Not unfriendly. Simply factual. My name is Nora Montoya. I'm Delia Montoya's daughter. My mother passed away earlier this week." Elena's expression shifted from assessment to something softer. "Come in," she said. The front room was small and kept with the same precision as the exterior of the house. A sofa, 2 chairs, a carpet that had been good once and was still presentable, every surface carrying photographs. A wedding photograph from the 1960s, a man with dark hair and a broad smile. Children at various ages, formal portraits and candid shots interleaved without system. Grandchildren on a beach somewhere warm. On the mantel above the fireplace, a small framed reproduction of an Italian landscape with mountains reflected in still water and a house at the shoreline with smoke rising from its chimney. They sat across from each other, Nora in one of the chairs, Elena on the sofa. "My mother left a letter," Nora said. "In the letter, she mentioned you specifically. She asked me to bring you something." Elena's hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly against each other. Nora produced the velvet box. She held it out across the low table between them. Elena took it. She looked at the handwritten label for a long moment, at her own name in Delia's small, precise cursive. Then she opened the box. She didn't touch the brooch. She looked at the 2 rubies and the gold filigree and the seed pearls in their vine pattern, the same as they had been in 1897 when a craftsman in Venice set each pearl by hand. Her breath went out slowly. She closed her eyes and sat with the open box in her hands. "She found it," Elena said, barely audible, 7 years ago, according to the letter. She kept it in a cabinet until she could return it properly. Elena was quiet. When she opened her eyes, they were bright, but she didn't let herself cry. She had the composure of someone who had decided decades ago how she would handle certain kinds of moments. "Did you touch the pearls?" she asked. "No." "Good. They've always been fragile. My grandmother used to say the man who made this was showing off. She said a real craftsman knows when to stop." A pause. "She also said she loved him for it." She held the box without closing it and looked at the brooch and then at the reproduction on the mantel. "My grandmother's name was Lucia," she said. "She came from Venice in 1920. She was 23 years old. She crossed on a cargo ship that was also carrying cured meats and machine parts. And she slept on a bunk in a room with 11 other women, and she ate what was provided, and she did not complain about any of it, because she was going to a country where she had a cousin who had written that there was work. She had $11 and a change of clothes, and this brooch pinned inside the lining of her coat, where it wouldn't be seen." Elena looked at the brooch. "She told me once that the brooch was what she brought instead of everything else. Instead of furniture. Instead of dishes. Instead of all the things people carry when they move their whole life somewhere new." She paused. "She said it was the most important thing she owned, and when I was very young I thought she meant because it was valuable. When I got older I understood that she meant it was the most important thing because it was the only thing she had managed to keep. Everything else you leave behind. But you sew the thing that matters into the lining of your coat, and you keep your hand over it on the ship." Nora waited. "She wore it on her wedding day in 1923. My mother wore it on her wedding day in 1951. You can see it in the photograph there, in the frame on the right." Elena nodded toward the mantel. "My mother wore it every Sunday to Mass for 25 years. She died in 1976, and the brooch came to me. I had a loose pearl. I was afraid to lose it, because there are 114 pearls on this piece, and each one was placed by hand, and I did not want to be the generation that lost the first one. She looked at the brooch one more time. I brought it to the shop on Main Street. The woman at the counter had very steady hands. She wrote up the ticket and told me 6 to 8 weeks. That was my mother, Nora said. Elena looked at her directly. Yes, I understand that now. A breath. I went back for it after 6 months, and the shop had moved. The man at the new location said the records from the old address were incomplete. He gave me back my deposit. For him, that was the end of it. She closed the box carefully with both hands. I went home and I sat with that reproduction on the mantel, which my mother had made from a photograph of the brooch when she was afraid of losing it, and I told myself that it was somewhere, that someone had it, that things don't simply disappear when you stop being able to see them. 35 years of telling yourself something like that is a long time. You begin to believe it because you need to, and then one day a woman you don't know knocks on your door, and it turns out you were right. There was one more thing Elena said before Nora left. She said, I knew your mother was working on something in that basement. I didn't know what. One night, perhaps 15 years ago, I was coming back from my daughter's, late, close to midnight. Your mother was in her driveway with a small wooden case, the kind with a brass clasp. She was carrying it from her car to the house by herself and being very careful with it, the way you're careful with something that matters. She saw me looking. We stood there for a moment across the street in the dark, and then she nodded and went inside, and I went inside, and we never mentioned it. Did you wonder what was in it? Nora asked. Of course. Elena looked at her hands. But with your mother, you didn't ask. You made your peace with not asking, and you respected what she kept to herself. That's not a criticism. That's just how she was. And I think it's how she had to be. Nora walked back to Sycamore Lane with the velvet box gone from her pocket and something harder to name in its place. A picture she hadn't had before. Her mother in a driveway at midnight with a wooden case, standing in the dark with one foot toward the house, and watching a neighbor across the street, deciding in that moment how much the world needed to know. Making the same calculation she had apparently made 10,000 times over 20 years. Not yet. Not this. After Elena's door closed behind her, Nora stood on the front porch for a moment in the pale spring sun. The tulips along the walk were the same red and yellow they'd been when she arrived. The morning continuing on its own terms while everything she understood shifted slightly in its position. She thought about a woman in her 20s making the crossing from Venice on a cargo ship with $11 and a brooch sewn into her coat lining. She thought about the same brooch on a wedding dress in 1923, on another wedding dress in 1951, through 30 years of Sunday Mass, and then into a jewelry shop on Main Street in a small Indiana town, and how the woman who took that repair ticket in 1989 had spent 35 years waiting in a house 2 blocks away to put it back where it belonged. Her mother had written down the brooch's description in a composition notebook the day she found it in Gerald's unpacked storage bin. She had written E. Marchetti, Venetian, 1897, not for sale, return to owner. She had kept that standard for 14 years. Nora walked back along Elm Street, and then down a block and west on the cross street, and back to Sycamore. The town was quiet in the mid-morning. A few cars, a woman 2 houses down watering a window box. The maple in front of 617 was beginning to show leaves, small and new and pale green. The tree doing what it had done every spring for 45 years, whether or not anyone who watched it was still there to watch. She let herself in and stood in the kitchen and thought about what Elena had said. With your mother, you didn't ask. And what Elena had also said, that's not a criticism. That's just how she was. And I think it's how she had to be. She understood that now in a way she hadn't 4 days ago. The not explaining was not withholding in the way she'd always experienced it as withholding. It was protection of the work, of the purpose the work served, of the person the work was for, who might have responded to early knowledge in ways that complicated everything, with demands or gifts, or the simple unwanted knowledge that changed the texture of a relationship before either person was ready for it to change. Her mother had wanted to give her something complete, not a fragment, not a partial draft. Something whole, with documentation, with meaning, with nothing left unresolved. She had spent 21 years building toward that completeness and had died before it arrived. and now Nora was standing in the kitchen at 617 Sycamore Lane, and the completeness was as close as it had ever been. At the house, Pruitt was waiting in his car. He gave her Robert Vale's direct number on a slip of paper. She called from the kitchen table. Vale answered on the third ring, in the clipped and efficient manner of someone who received many calls and had learned to be direct about all of them. She told him her name, her mother's name, the reason for calling. "I can be there tomorrow morning," he said. 8 o'clock. He arrived at 7:58 in a gray Volvo with a hard-sided equipment case in the back seat and a worn briefcase in the passenger seat. He was 58 years old, trim, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades looking at very small things very carefully. He shook her hand on the porch, thanked her for calling, and asked to go straight downstairs. She unlocked the basement door, and he descended ahead of her without hesitating. At the bottom, he stood for a moment and turned in a slow half-circle, doing what she recognized as a systematic first scan of the whole room before touching anything. Then he set his equipment case on the floor, opened it, and laid out his instruments on a section of cleared shelf. A jeweler's loupe, a calibrated magnifying glass on an extension arm, a small ultraviolet lamp, a digital micrometer, and a notebook with a worn cover that he opened to a fresh page. "I'll need quiet," he said, not as a request, as a statement of working condition. She went upstairs. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with her mother's 2003 notebook, the first one, and opened it from the beginning. The early entries were pure documentation. Acquisition records, descriptions, condition notes, estimated values cross-referenced against auction guides. Gerald's 41 pieces were logged with the same compact precision as everything that followed, each piece described in 4 or 5 lines, no more. The notebook read like a ledger book from a very careful merchant. But by page 40, something had shifted. In an entry from late 2003, went to Greenfield for the Parsons estate. 3 pieces worth acquiring. Paid $210 total. The silver brooch needs cleaning, but the construction is good. The Hamilton Railroad watch needs service, but runs. Then, below the acquisition record, separated by a space, Nora is teaching now. Columbus. She called last Sunday, and I almost told her. Next time. Nora stopped. She read that again. Almost told her. As if the thought had been sitting there, formed and ready, and she had stopped herself. Next time. As if the telling was something that required the right moment, and the right moment kept not arriving. She turned pages. December 2004. Purchased a Hamilton pocket watch from the Moorfield estate, Spiceland. Excellent example of a railroad-grade movement, fully running, case worn but sound. Estimated value $800 to $1,200. Then, Christmas. Called Nora. 12 minutes. She sounds tired. She is managing. I don't know how to ask if she's truly all right in a way that would let her actually answer. She set the notebook down and picked up her coffee and held it. She also found, in 2006, a passage she had to read twice. I've been thinking about what I would say if Nora called and asked directly about the basement. I've prepared an answer that is technically true, that there's water damage, that the floor isn't safe, that there's nothing worth seeing. All 3 of these things are false. The floor is sound concrete, sealed in 2004. The water damage was remediated in 2001 before I began acquiring in any serious way. And what's worth seeing down there is, by my best estimate, more than this house is worth by a factor of several. So the answer is false, but I will give it if I need to give it, and I won't feel good about it, and it will be the necessary thing. That was in 2006. Nora had been 29 years old. She hadn't asked. In 2008, an entry she found 2 pages from the one about the Crawfordsville estate sale. I looked up the address of Nora's school in Columbus. Franklin Middle School on 3rd Street. I drove past it once in 2005 on the way to an estate sale in Worthington, Ohio. I parked across the street and watched the building for perhaps 20 minutes. I don't know what I was hoping to see. She wasn't visible from the car. Eventually, I drove to the sale. I bought a lavalier pendant and a coin silver beaker and drove home. I did not go back. I understand that this is not an acceptable way to maintain a relationship with your own child. I'm not sure I have a better way. Her mother had called her at Christmas in 2004 and had sat across a kitchen table from a composition notebook containing hundreds of thousands of dollars in documented jewelry and had said, "How is the teaching going?" It's cold here. Have you got a good coat? She went back to reading. In 2005, a longer personal entry she hadn't expected to find. I think about Ernesto sometimes. Not with bitterness. I passed through bitterness years ago and came out the other side of it into something more like understanding, though not forgiveness, which is different and which I'm not sure is required of me. He was not suited to this life. The town, the house, the long winters. He needed something I couldn't provide, and he found it somewhere else. And the leaving was what it was, and what came after was what it was, and I raised Nora, and I kept the house, and I built what I built. I think he would be surprised if he knew. I'm not sure why I care whether he would be surprised. But I do. She sat with that for a while before turning pages. In 2009, I went to an estate sale in Blackford County last Saturday. 2 pieces worth acquiring, and one I almost didn't pick up because at first glance it looked like a well-made reproduction. I examined it for 10 minutes in the seller's driveway in the cold, and then paid $85 and drove home feeling as if I might have done something significant without being entirely certain of what it was. The dragonfly brooch. Enamel on gold. Art Nouveau, quite possibly French. The mark on the reverse is compelling. Research needed. Then, a week later in the same notebook, the research is ongoing. I've sent photographs to 2 specialists. I'm certain enough of the maker that I've begun looking at the production records. If I'm right about what this is, I paid $85 for something that will require me to sit down for a while when I find out what it's worth. In 2010, the Lalique attribution is confirmed. 2 specialists, independently, without knowing the other had been consulted. The brooch is authentic and the production number is from the known series. I know what series it's from. I know what the documentation says about how many examples were made and how many have been publicly located. I've been staring at the piece for 20 minutes in the good light, and I understand that I am holding something that has not been seen in the public literature for a very long time. I sat down. Then I stood up and made tea and sat down again. Nora smiled. In 2011, after the mortgage was paid, the house is mine now. Entirely. The bank sent the paperwork and I signed it, and there is nothing against this property except the property taxes and my own intention to stay in it. I find that I'm not as relieved as I expected to be. What I feel instead is something closer to ready, though I can't fully say ready for what. In 2013, an entry she recognized from the fragment she'd found the day before, now complete. I found a ring at the Whitfield estate in April. I almost didn't go to that sale. I went because Beverly mentioned it, and I had nothing else on that Saturday, and the drive was only 40 minutes. The ring is Edwardian, platinum, a center diamond in an old European cut that I estimate at approximately 2 carats, surrounded by smaller diamonds in a sunburst setting. The cut and the quality of the stones are well above what you find at a county estate sale. Someone in the Whitfield family had excellent taste and the money to act on it. I paid $650. I'm aware of what it's worth, and I didn't buy it because of that. I bought it because when I held it up to the window in the Whitfield living room and the stones caught the light, I felt something I don't often feel, which was a wish that I had someone to show it to. I brought it home and put it in its slot and wrote it up in the notebook and thought about that wish for the rest of the evening. In 2014, the entry she'd found the day before, the one about wanting to give Nora something that couldn't be touched by whatever arrangements she made with other people. She reread it now more slowly. The final line. I need to get the documentation on the parure resolved this year. The provenance is incomplete, and until I've completed it, I can't transfer the set with confidence. But that ring is everything I want to give her, not because of what it's worth, because of what it means when you hold something like that up to the light. She didn't know which ring her mother meant, the Whitfield ring or another one. There were hundreds of rings in the cases downstairs. Her mother had never specified. She was still thinking about it when Vale came upstairs at noon. He sat at the kitchen table across from her, cleaned his reading glasses with the cloth from his breast pocket, set them down beside his notepad. He'd been downstairs for 4 hours. I want to come back tomorrow, he said. But I can give you a preliminary account of 3 specific items. Please. He opened his notepad. The handwriting was small and vertical, formed by someone accustomed to taking notes in confined spaces and available light. Your mother's documentation is exceptional, he said. I want to say that directly, not as a pleasantry. The acquisition records, provenance research, condition notes, cross-references to auction records, and specialist literature. In 26 years of estate assessment work, I have seen 3 private collections documented to this standard. Your mother approached this the way a museum curator approaches a permanent collection, which is to say, with the long view. She wasn't documenting for her own reference. She was documenting for whoever came after her. Nora said nothing. The collection contains approximately 860 individual pieces, my count from today, which I'll confirm tomorrow. The range I provided in October holds 6.8 to 8.2 million at current auction estimates. Moving the collection as individual pieces over time would almost certainly produce a better outcome than a single lot sale. He turned to his notes. There are 3 specific items I need to talk about. He turned a page. The first is a brooch. Enamel on 18-karat gold, dragonfly motif, signed on the reverse with the Lalique mark and a production number. I spent 40 minutes with it this morning. Lalique produced a series of dragonfly brooches in this exact design between 1898 and 1902. 12 examples total, each with a sequential number. 2 are in museum permanent collections, the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris and the Metropolitan in New York. Of the remaining 10, 9 have appeared in public sales or collections in the past century. The 10th has not appeared in the literature since 1911. He looked at her. I examined the production number on your mother's piece through the loop. The enamel work is consistent with Lalique's technique from this specific period. The mark is authentic. The number belongs to the undocumented example. He paused. Your mother's notes say possible Lalique. Further research needed. There's a clipped page where she confirmed the attribution in 2010. She appears not to have researched the production number against the catalog. She mentioned in her notebook that she knew it was from the documented series, Nora said. She didn't say she'd identified which example it was. She would have needed the Lalique catalog to do that comparison, and the catalog is not widely available outside specialist libraries. He set down his pen. The auction estimate for a documented Lalique dragonfly in this series runs between $200,000 and $320,000, depending on condition and provenance. The condition on your mother's piece is exceptional. He paused. She paid $85 for it. The second item was the parure, necklace, earrings, and bracelet, diamond and platinum, late 19th century European manufacture. Bill had spent close to an hour with the set. The quality of the stones was well above average for the period. 47 old European cut diamonds matched for color and size across the 3 pieces, set in platinum mounts of remarkable workmanship. When I held the necklace under the light in your mother's basement, Vale said, I understood within 30 seconds that this was not ordinary estate jewelry. There is a precision in the setting and a quality in the stones that you encounter perhaps once or twice in a career working with private collections. Someone made this for a specific person at a specific moment, and both the maker and the person receiving it had very high standards and the resources to insist on them. He turned a page. There's a partial engraving on the bracelet clasp. 3 letters in a monogram style that I haven't fully identified yet. I'm going to look at it again tomorrow under different light. What I can tell you now is that the style and the materials are consistent with European high society jewelry from the period between approximately 1888 and 1895. This set did not originate in Indiana. It got here the way things like this usually get to the American Midwest: immigration, estate dispersal, a family that came down in circumstances. Your mother acquired it in 1998 at a Marion County auction. He looked up. 1998. Before 2003, Nora said. Before the notebooks start. He made a note. I'll look tomorrow for anything in the collection that might indicate when she started acquiring. Specifically, there may be pieces that predate the documentation by years. The third piece was the watch. Vale described it as he had described it to Nora the day before: the Patek Philippe, the serial number, the call to the Patek archive. The Harrington estate. The watch reported missing from the probate in 1967. Delia's acquisition in 2007 for $420 at a Blackford County estate sale. He slid his notepad across the table. He had copied the 2019 notebook entry in his vertical hand. The Harrington case confirmed. Filed separately. The watch was only part of it. I didn't find anything in the cabinet or on the shelves that corresponds to filed separately, he said. Do you have any indication of what she meant? I'm still reading the notebooks, Nora said. He nodded, closed his notepad, capped his pen, stood. 8 o'clock tomorrow. Beverly came by that afternoon with her daughter Susan, who'd driven down from Indianapolis for the weekend. They brought casseroles, and Beverly brought something else. She had spoken that morning with Joyce Ketterman, who lived on Elm Street, 3 houses from Elena Marchetti. Joyce was 81, had known Delia for 40 years, and had been holding something she decided should be shared. Now that Delia was gone, 20 years ago, Joyce's husband had died and left behind a situation she hadn't known about. A second mortgage, credit card debt accumulated over years without her knowledge, a gap between what she believed was their financial reality and what was actually true. She'd been 4 months from losing the house before she understood the full extent of it. She hadn't told anyone because she was ashamed of having not known, and she didn't know who to tell. Delia had appeared at her door on a Tuesday evening in October. She had asked if she could come in. She hadn't explained why she was there, and Joyce had let her in because you let Delia Montoya in when she came to your door. That was simply what you did. They sat at Joyce's kitchen table, and Delia had written a number on a piece of paper, a specific number, and slid it across, and said, "This is a loan, not a gift, and here are the repayment terms, and I need you to tell me if this solves the problem." It had solved the problem exactly. Joyce paid it back in full over 3 years. Not a week late, not a dollar short. Delia accepted the payments without discussion and didn't mention the matter again. Joyce told no one, because she understood instinctively that Delia's privacy on the subject was not a suggestion. She told Beverly now only because she was 81 years old, and she felt that Nora should know the kind of person her mother had been, and because Delia was gone, and because Joyce had been carrying the knowledge alone for 20 years, and it had started to feel too heavy to carry anymore. Nora thought about the savings account with $9,000 in it. The only account Pruitt had found. A loan like that, 20 years ago, would have represented years of careful saving. Not from the collection, which wouldn't have been converted to cash without complications. From whatever a woman who spent very little on herself and worked every hour she worked was able to set aside without anyone seeing. Beverly stayed for almost 2 hours. She and Susan went through the upstairs rooms methodically while Nora sat at the kitchen table, and the sound of them moving through the house, opening closets and talking quietly to each other, was oddly comforting in the way that activity in an empty house is comforting. At some point, Beverly came downstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway. "I want to say something," Beverly said. "I'm not sure I have the right to say it, but I'm going to." Nora looked up. "Your mother loved you. I know that's obvious to say. It probably sounds obvious. But I watched her from next door for 37 years, and I want you to know that I saw it. The way it came out in small ways when she thought no one was paying attention. When you called on Sundays, I could see the kitchen light from my living room window, and she'd stand at the counter while she talked to you, and when she hung up, she'd stand there for a few minutes afterward, just standing, like she was holding the call in her hands before she set it down." Beverly paused. She wasn't good at saying things. "I knew that. But I watched her, and I want you to know that I saw it." Nora didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Thank you." "You're welcome." Beverly straightened. "Now, Susan found some things in the upstairs closet that might be yours from childhood. We put them on the bed in your old room. Come look when you're ready." Beverly and Susan left around 3. Nora went back to the notebooks. She went upstairs briefly to look at what Beverly and Susan had found. A box in the back of the closet in her old room, a shoebox, taped shut, with her name on top in her mother's handwriting. She opened it. Inside, a small clay figure she had made in 3rd grade art class, broken at the neck and repaired with white glue. A photograph of her at about 10 years old, in the backyard, holding a cat she didn't remember having. A stack of her own childhood drawings on newsprint and construction paper, stored flat and undamaged. Her 1st grade reading certificate. A lock of hair in a paper envelope with a date written on the outside in her mother's hand, June 3rd, 1985. The day she was born. Delia had kept all of it. In a shoebox in the back of a closet for 40 years, where it would not be seen or discussed or explained. Nora held the box for a while. Then she put the lid back on and went downstairs. She made tea, which she almost never drank, because it was what her mother had in the cabinet, and she was in her mother's kitchen, and it seemed right to use what was there. She stood at the counter while it steeped and looked out the window at the backyard. The clothesline poles stood at their same positions they'd stood in for 40 years, the lines sagging slightly between them. The unplanted vegetable patch along the fence showed the outlines of old furrows from the previous season, still visible in the softening April soil. 21 years of composition notebooks. The first one started 44 days after Gerald Thatcher gave Delia a cardboard box of unclaimed jewelry and told her to do something with it or throw it out. She wondered how many hours of her mother's life had gone into this room. Not counting the acquisitions themselves, the estate sales and the auction houses, and the careful negotiations with sellers who didn't always understand what they had. Just the documentation, the description of each piece, the provenance research, the cross-referencing, the labeling, the installation in the correct slot with the correct velvet. An hour per piece, conservatively, for 860 pieces, was 860 hours. Call it 400 hours of documentation work per year for 20 years, 8,000 hours. That was conservative, almost certainly an undercount. 8,000 hours of work, in a room no one else entered, for a person who didn't know it existed. She worked forward, chronologically, reading the entries that broke from the transactional pattern into something more personal. In 2015, the collection crossed $1 million in my revised estimate this spring. I've been tracking auction results more carefully and adjusting as I go. 1 million seems like a number that should feel different from the numbers before it. It doesn't feel very different. I think the number doesn't change what the work means. The work means the same thing it has always meant. Then, on the next page, Nora called Sunday. She sounded the way she's been sounding for 2 years now, which is like someone who is managing something difficult without saying what it is. I know that sound. I made that sound for several years after Ernesto left. I want to tell her that the managing gets easier. I want to tell her other things. I don't know how to start. In 2017, revised estimate puts the collection at approximately $4 million. Robert Vale reviewed a sample of the pieces last spring at my request, and his estimate was consistent. I find that I think about this number less than I expected to. What I think about more is the documentation, which is not complete in all the ways I want it to be complete. The Harrington provenance in particular. 9 years since I acquired the watch, and I'm still pulling threads. In 2018, I'm going to finish the Harrington research this year. 9 years is long enough to spend on a thread. Time to pull it to its end. In March of 2019, an entry that ran longer than most. I drove to Muncie on Saturday to look at a case at an auction house. I'd seen the listing 3 weeks ago, and I had to look at the listing twice and then sit with it for several days before I was ready to make the call. I went on a Saturday. The owner brought it out and set it on the table, and I sat across from it, and I thought, yes. I knew from the photograph, but the photograph is never the thing itself. The thing itself was this. I went back 2 more times over 3 weeks before the owner finally understood what he had, and even then I don't think he fully understood. I paid $11,000. Which is more than I've paid for any single item in the collection by a significant margin. I drove home in the dark. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I was ready to carry it inside. And then the entry Vale had shown her, the Harrington case confirmed. Filed separately. The watch was only part of it. And then, 6 months later, the last entry about it in the 2019 notebook, brief. I have the documentation at 70%. I want it at 100. I'm taking my time. This one needs to be done correctly. The 2019 notebook's back cover held the slip of paper she'd already found. She checked the notebooks from 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. The Harrington case appeared in only 2 more entries, brief references to the documentation work continuing. The last reference was in early 2023. The Harrington documentation is as complete as I can make it. I've had it verified by 2 independent specialists. I'm satisfied. Then, in March of 2023, an entry that had nothing to do with acquisitions or documentation. I was diagnosed this week with congestive heart failure. The doctor used the word manageable, which I understand is meant to be reassuring. I've started the letter. I've thrown it away twice. I'll try again this weekend. 14 months before she died. Sitting at this table with this kitchen around her and a basement full of 20 years of work and a letter that wouldn't come out right. Trying again. Nora closed the notebook and sat for a while in the kitchen. She'd gone back to Ohio 3 or 4 times over the decades. Twice for funerals, once when a school friend was getting married. She'd driven through Byers Creek each time without stopping because stopping meant encountering the padlock and the question she no longer asked. She'd told herself she and her mother had settled into a kind of peace with the distance between them. She understood now that she had settled into it alone. Delia had never settled. She had been working. Then Chad Mercer called. The friendly professionalism she'd heard in their first exchange was still present as a layer, but something beneath it had shifted. He said he respected her decision and wanted to make sure she had all the relevant information. And then he mentioned a right-of-way question his attorneys had identified in the alley behind the Sycamore Lane properties, and a municipal code that applied to estates in active probate, and a conditional variance the city had granted 2 years ago based on the assumption that this parcel would be part of the project. None of it was explicit. All of it was the practiced language of a man accustomed to creating friction until people decided the friction wasn't worth the cost. If there are legal questions about the property, I'll have my attorney look at them, Nora said. She called Pruitt immediately after. He was quiet for a moment, and then said the right-of-way claim was likely without merit. The alley had been in its current configuration since the 50s. The probate code didn't apply. He's creating friction. He can cause delays. He can't cause outcomes. Mercer's attorney sent a formal letter the next morning citing the variance and requesting that no changes be made to the property pending resolution. Pruitt said it was largely creative writing and that he would respond. Nora went to the basement that evening. The Patek Philippe watch sat in its slot in the glass front watch cabinet. She could see it from the doorway of the clock section. A plain gold case, hunter style, the kind a man carried in a vest pocket in 1911 and checked at intervals throughout the day the way people check their phones now. For the time, yes, but also as an object of reassurance, something substantial and cool in the pocket when you needed to put your hand on something reliable. James Harrington had carried it for 56 years. Then it had passed through unknown hands and houses and estate sales for 40 more years before arriving at a Blackford County table in 2007, where her mother had picked it up and read the serial number on the movement and understood that she'd found something that had been missing for a long time. She stood at the center of the room in the even overhead light and looked at the grandfather clock against the far wall. It stood between the watch display cases and the gemstone cabinet, a tall case clock in dark walnut, solid and substantial, mid-20th century American manufacture. Not antique in the sense of the pieces surrounding it, not part of the collection in the way the pieces on the shelves were part of the collection, but present, occupying its corner with the settled weight of something that had been put somewhere deliberately and left there. The pendulum hung still at center. The hands on the face showed 3:47, motionless. She'd seen it the first time she came downstairs and registered it as furniture, something to arrange the room around rather than something that had arrived as part of a considered decision. Looking at it now, she understood that the distinction was precisely what her mother had intended. She went to the clock and opened the front panel. The interior smelled of old machine oil and something dry. The pendulum rod hung at center, the bob at the bottom, brass darkened by decades of air. The movement above clicked faintly at its own interval, still running on its spring. The pendulum, simply no longer coupled to the escapement, stopped at some point in the past and not restarted. Behind the pendulum, visible when she leaned in, the rear wall of the clock case. Plainer wood than the exterior, less finished, the kind of surface no one was meant to see. And set against that wall, attached to 2 small hooks screwed into the wood at shoulder height, a leather case about the size of a large book. She reached in with both hands, working carefully around the pendulum bob, and lifted the case from its hooks. It came free with no resistance. Her mother had placed it where it could be reached without tools, without force, by someone who knew to look. She carried it to the desk and sat down and examined it in the overhead light. Dark brown leather, the kind that had been expensive when it was made and had aged into something that looked traveled in the specific way of objects that have been through time rather than simply stored. The corners were fitted with brass reinforcing plates, tarnished nearly black. The clasp on the front was a single brass button worn smooth from use. Along the top edge, barely visible in the leather surface, a set of initials stamped in gilt letters from which nearly all the gilt had worn away. J. H. James Harrington. A banker from Indianapolis who had died in 1967, whose personal collection had been partially reported missing at probate, whose pocket watch had passed through unknown hands for 40 years before appearing at a Blackford County estate sale in 2007, where her mother had paid $420 for it and begun 12 years of research into what it connected to. Nora held the case without opening it for a moment. Then she pressed the brass clasp and lifted the lid. The interior was fitted with a series of divided compartments, each lined in ivory silk that had yellowed to the color of old paper but was otherwise undamaged, each sized with deliberate care for objects that had been considered and placed. Most of the compartments were empty. The silk in them bore the faint pressure marks and surface shadows of objects that had rested there and been removed at some point long before the case reached an auction house in Muncie. Round impressions, rectangular ones, the outline of something cylindrical. Objects whose shapes she could partly reconstruct from the marks they'd left, but whose nature she couldn't determine. In the center compartment, the largest, fitted into the ivory silk the way something carefully placed is different from something merely stored, was a bound document. Not a single sheet. Several dozen pages by the look of the thickness, folded and wrapped in oilskin that had been tied with faded twine. Someone had wrapped this with the specific intent of protecting it through time. Someone had thought about this lasting. And beside the document, in the smallest compartment on the right side of the case, flat against the silk, a ring. A plain gold band, the kind worn every day for a long time. On the inside, when she tilted it into the light, J. H. to A. H. September 14th, 1911. The same date as the watch. September 14, 1911. A wedding date. The watch and the ring given on the same morning, to the same man, by the woman who would wear this initial beside his. Both of them placed eventually in this case, which had traveled somewhere in the intervening years and lost most of its other contents, and ended up at a Muncie auction house where a woman from Byers Creek had driven out 3 separate times to pay $11,000 for it. Nora held the oilskin document without untying the twine. Her mother had written in 2019. The watch was only part of it. She had written in 2023 that the documentation was complete and verified. She had placed this case behind the pendulum of a grandfather clock in a basement no one else had been in for 21 years, and she had written on a slip of paper tucked into the back of the 2019 notebook, behind the clock. When you're ready. When you're ready. Not when you need to. When you're ready. Nora set the document back in the center compartment of the case and closed the lid. She called Vale. He answered on the second ring. The Harrington case, she said. I found it. A leather case with his initials. There's a document wrapped in oilskin and a wedding ring. Both. Connected to Harrington. Same date as the watch. A pause that was longer than his usual pauses. Don't open the document, he said. Please. Not until I'm there, and we can do it correctly. I wasn't going to. 7 o'clock tomorrow. She set the case on the desk beside the row of composition notebooks. 20 years of work lined up in order, the last one ending mid-thought. More to come that hadn't come. She looked at the room around her, at the glass front cases and the velvet-lined shelves and the labeled compartments and the ceiling-mounted lights that her mother had installed to make sure everything was clearly visible and nothing was lost in shadow. She thought about a woman who had built all of this in silence, one piece at a time, one estate sale at a time, one correctly written label at a time, for 21 years, and who had never found the right moment to say, "This is what I made, and it is for you, and I need you to know I made it on purpose." The overhead lights were steady and cool. The climate control unit hummed at its constant frequency. The room held its temperature and its humidity and its inventory, exactly as Delia had left it, waiting for morning. Nora slept for 4 hours on the narrow bed in her old room, which was more sleep than she'd gotten any night since the parking lot of the Dollar General. She woke at 5:30 with gray light coming through the curtains and the sound of a single bird somewhere in the maple tree, making the specific sound that birds make in early spring when the light comes back before the warmth does, a sound of insistence rather than celebration. She showered and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the leather case open in front of her, not touching the oilskin document, just looking at it. The ring sat in its small compartment beside it, gold and plain, the engraving on the inside too small to read from where she sat, but present in her mind. J. H. to A. H. September 14th, 1911. 115 years ago, a man and a woman in Indianapolis on a September morning, exchanging a watch and a ring, beginning something. The bird in the maple tree called again, twice, then stopped. She could hear the house around her, the furnace cycling on and off, the particular language of an old structure that had been maintaining itself through Indiana winters since 1942 and had gotten good at it. She had started hearing the house differently in the past week, not as the sound of a building she was in, but as the sound of a building she was living in, which were different in the way that a place you're visiting is different from a place you're from. She thought about all the mornings her mother had sat at this same table. 45 years of mornings. Coffee from the same machine. The same yellow curtains on the window above the sink, replaced once, maybe twice, but always the same yellow because that was what the kitchen needed. A woman making the same practical decisions every morning for 45 years, in a house she'd chosen to stay in when she could have left, building something in the room below her feet that no one else knew was there. She thought about her mother driving home from Muncie in the dark with this case in the back of her car, sitting in the driveway for 20 minutes before she felt ready to carry it inside. She thought about what it meant to recognize something you'd been looking for without knowing you were looking for it, to hold a thing in your hands and understand that this was where the thread had been leading for 12 years. At 6:59, she heard a car in the driveway. Vale came to the basement door directly, without stopping in the kitchen, carrying his equipment case and a second bag she hadn't seen before, a flat canvas case he set carefully on the desk beside the Harrington leather case. He looked at the oilskin document in its center compartment for a long moment, and then looked at her. "You didn't open it," he said. "You asked me not to." He nodded and opened his canvas case. Inside, laid flat in protective foam, a pair of cotton examination gloves, a magnifying lamp on a flexible arm, a set of small probes, acid-free tissue paper, and a spray bottle of what he explained was a conservation-grade humidifier for aged paper. He pulled on the gloves with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for decades. "Before I open it," he said, "I want to tell you something. Whatever is in here, the conservation of the document is the first priority. If the paper is fragile, we may not be able to fully open it today. We take what we can and come back." "All right." He lifted the oilskin packet from the case with both hands, set it on the desk surface, and examined it from every angle without touching the twine. The oilskin was dark, slightly stiff, had been folded many times over its life, and had taken those folds permanently. He sprayed a faint mist near the twine, not on it, waiting for the humidity to soften the fibers slightly. Then he untied the knot. It came apart with very little resistance. He unfolded the oilskin one layer at a time. Each fold opened slowly and set flat before the next was touched. Inside the final fold, 2 separate packets of paper, each wrapped individually in plain white tissue that had yellowed to the color of old cream. He opened the first. Several sheets of heavyweight paper, folded in thirds the way a letter is folded before it goes into an envelope. The paper had aged to pale tan, but was otherwise sound. The handwriting on the first sheet was in a formal style from the earlier part of the century, neat and deliberate, written with a broad-nib pen in blue ink that had gone brown with age. He set it in front of Nora. She read it. The document was headed, "To be placed with the estate records of James Robert Harrington, Indianapolis, Indiana." It was signed at the bottom in the same hand, "James R. Harrington, January 3rd, 1962. A man in his late 80s, writing in the winter of the last decade of his life, to make something clear while he still could. He wrote that the diamond parure, necklace, earrings, bracelet, platinum set, approximately 47 stones, currently held with his personal effects, was the property of his late wife Annabelle Harrington, born Annabelle von Schreiber of Vienna, Austria. The set had been given to Annabelle by her parents, Otto and Margarethe von Schreiber, as a wedding gift on September 14, 1911, the day of her marriage to James. The von Schreibers had been a banking family in Vienna with established offices also in Frankfurt. They had emigrated from Austria in 1938, and the European branches of the family had subsequently dispersed across several countries. Annabelle's parents had died in New York in 1943 and 1947 respectively, without other children. He wrote that the parure had never been sold or transferred and was the lawful property of his and Annabelle's estate, with no claim against it from any other party. He wrote that he was setting this down because he understood that his estate, after his death, would pass to relatives who had not known Annabelle and would have no context for the objects he'd kept, and he wanted the provenance of the set to be on record in plain language rather than in the form of documents they'd be unlikely to understand. He wrote, at the end, The set should be sold, after my death, to someone who will value it. I have no use for it without Annabelle and no one to give it to. I only ask that whoever values it understands what it was given to Mark. The document ran 4 pages. Nora read it twice. She looked at Vale. The parure you found in the collection, she said. Yes, he said. I believe so. My mother bought it in 1998 at a Marion County auction, which would have been an estate sale for whoever inherited Harrington's effects from the distant relatives. He was looking at the document, not at her. The watch came to a different branch of those same relatives and appeared in Blackford County in 2007. He paused. Your mother found the watch in 2007, connected it to the parure she'd bought 9 years earlier in Marion County, and spent 12 years confirming the connection through the Harrington estate records. She set down the first packet and looked at the second. May I? She asked. It's yours, he said. She opened the second packet. This paper was thinner than the first, more personal, the kind sold in boxes at department stores with envelopes to match. 3 sheets, handwritten in a different hand from the first document. Smaller, rounder, written with a finer pen, with the particular slight irregularity of someone writing under physical difficulty. The date at the top was June 19, 1958. 3 months before Annabelle Harrington died of heart failure in the house on North Meridian Street in Indianapolis. Dear James, I have been trying to write this for some time, and the words have not come correctly. And I'm told I do not have enough time left to wait for them to come correctly, so I'm writing it down as it is. You have been a careful and patient man for 47 years. You were patient with the first years when I didn't know how to be a wife in this country, and everything I did was wrong by the local measure. You were patient with Harold, who was difficult from the beginning and never got easier. You were patient after Harold died, when I was not easy to be near for a very long time. You learned not to mention his name when I couldn't hear it, and to mention it when I needed to. I don't know when you learned to tell the difference. You just did. I want you to know that I understood what you were doing all those years, when you came home from the bank and made dinner if I wasn't well, and didn't say it was an accommodation. When you rearranged your schedule in 1951 and 52 to be near me without calling it what it was. You were very careful never to say that you were doing anything in particular. I noticed every single time. I am leaving the parure with you in the case. I cannot take it where I'm going, and I won't give it to the relatives, who will not know what it is. It was my parents' last gift to me and the last thing of theirs that exists anywhere. I want it to be with you, and I want you to keep it near you until you decide what to do with it. And if you never decide, that's all right too. Keep the ring in the case with the watch. I want the 3 things together. I have been happy, James. I want you to know that plainly. The country was strange, and the years were hard in places, and we lost Harold, and I was not always the woman you needed. But I have been happy in the specific way that comes from being with someone who knows how to be present without making you feel the weight of it. You have a gift for that, and I want you to know I know it, and I am grateful for every year of it. I love you, and I'll be waiting. Annabelle. Nora set the letter down. She did not look at Vale. She looked at the desk surface, at the pale tan paper with the brown ink handwriting, at the words of a woman who had sat in a house in Indianapolis in the summer of 1958 and written what she needed to say while she still had time to write it. Vale did not speak. He had the particular discipline of someone who understood that some silences needed to be held and not filled. After a while, Nora said, My mother called this the most significant acquisition of her career. Because of the provenance value, Vale said. The letter establishes the parure's complete history. A European family piece with documented provenance. The parure's auction estimate will be considerably higher than I gave without it. The 2 pieces together, the parure and the watch, as part of the same documented story, may produce a result well above either piece independently. That's not why she called it the most significant, Nora said. He looked at her. She called it the most significant because of this. She put her hand flat on Annabelle's letter. Because this is a woman who found a way to say the things she needed to say before she ran out of time. My mother spent 21 years trying to find a way to say something to me, and she never managed it while she was alive. She recognized what this was. She understood it from the inside. Vale was quiet for a moment. Then, I see. She kept it separate from the collection because it wasn't part of the collection. It was a letter. It was someone's private letter. She was trying to figure out what the correct thing to do with it was. She spent 6 years on that. What do you think the correct thing is? Nora looked at Annabelle's handwriting. the slight irregularity of it, the evidence of the physical difficulty that the letter acknowledged and didn't dwell on. I think this should go to the Harrington family, if any of them can be found. Or, if not, to a historical archive in Indianapolis. Someone should know this letter exists. Someone should know what she said. The room was very quiet. Outside, the street made its ordinary sounds, a car passing, a dog somewhere 2 blocks away, a child on a bicycle going by the side window. All of it continuing. All of it indifferent in the way the world always is to what happens inside houses when people are reading letters that were written 68 years ago by women who were dying and knew it and wrote down what they needed to say anyway. She thought about her mother finding this letter in Muncie, reading it for the first time in a parking lot, or at her kitchen table, or in this basement. Understanding what she held. Understanding, as she must have understood immediately, that this was something she'd never had. The evidence that a person who had not known how to say the right things could find a way to say them, even if imperfectly and late, and through the medium of a piece of paper that had spent 60 years folded in oilskin inside a leather case that moved from house to house, without anyone knowing what it contained. Her mother had built a room full of beautiful things and told no one it existed. Annabelle Harrington had written a letter to a man who had been patient with her for 47 years and tucked it in a case and died 3 months later. Both of them working in silence toward the same end, which was to say, I see you. I know what you did. It mattered. You mattered. She folded Annabelle's letter back into its tissue paper carefully, the way Vale had opened it. Vale spent the rest of the morning completing his examination of the collection, returning to pieces he'd flagged the day before, re-examining the parure with the provenance letter now available. When he came upstairs at noon, he sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and gave her the complete assessment. 863 individual pieces. 7 documented watches of significant auction value, of which the Patek Philippe was the most significant at an estimated value between $750,000 and $1,100,000, with the Harrington provenance letter adding certainty to the high end of that range. The Lalique Dragonfly brooch at $250,000 to $320,000. The parure, with the von Schreiber provenance documentation now established through Harrington's letter, at $600,000 to $850,000. The total revised estimate, accounting for the provenance documentation that had not been available in October, $7.4 million to $9.6 million. Nora sat with that number for a moment. The documentation your mother kept is the difference between the October estimate and the current one, Vale said. Provenance adds value in ways that aren't immediately obvious. These are not simply pieces of jewelry. They are pieces of jewelry with histories. The histories are what buyers pay the premium for. Your mother understood this. She understood it from working at Thatcher's for 22 years. And from 40 years of thinking carefully about what things mean versus what they're worth. He closed his notebook. She also built something that should take months to properly transfer, not days. I want to be clear about that. The correct approach is to find the right placement for each significant piece, which takes time and relationships with the right auction houses and buyers. Moving this collection as individual pieces over 12 to 18 months will produce a substantially better outcome than any single transaction. I'm not in a hurry, Nora said. Good. He left her with the name of an estate auction house in Chicago and one in New York, with his personal recommendation attached, and said to tell them he'd sent her. The letter from Mercer's attorney arrived by courier that same afternoon, a second, more formal version of the right-of-way claim with additional language about the conditional variance and a deadline for response. Pruitt had already drafted a response, which he sent by return courier within 2 hours. It contained copies of county survey records from 1953 and 1968 confirming the alley configuration. It also contained, as an attachment, a printed copy of a story that had run that morning in the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette. A reporter named Catherine Wu had called Nora 2 days earlier, introduced as a journalist covering small business and development in the region, and Nora had spoken to her for 40 minutes about the sequence of events since her arrival in Byers Creek. The story ran under a headline about development pressure in Indiana small towns, with Byers Creek as a case study. It quoted Beverly Creel on the history of the block. It quoted Daniel Pruitt on the legal merit of Mercer's claims. It quoted Nora directly. My mother said no to this 3 times. She was still saying no when she died. I'm continuing that. The story did not mention the collection. Nora had not mentioned the collection to Catherine Wu. That information would become public through other channels, in time, but it was not Mercer's to know about, and it was not relevant to the question of whether she owed him anything. Mercer's attorney sent no further correspondence. Mercer himself did not call again. Beverly told Nora 3 days later that she'd seen his project vehicles on the block twice since the story ran, and neither time did anyone approach 617. Nora called Franklin Middle School that Friday. The principal, a man named Gerald Okafor who had worked with her for 6 years, listened to the situation without interrupting. She explained the estate, the complexity of the collection, the expected 12 to 18 months of transfer process. She asked for an extended leave of absence. How long? Okafor asked. Through the end of the school year to start. Possibly through next fall. I don't know yet. He was quiet for a moment. Your students are going to miss you. Your 7th period class is going to miss you in particular because they're a difficult group and you're the only teacher they trust. A pause. Take what you need. Come back when you're ready. We'll cover the classes. She thanked him and sat for a while at the kitchen table after the call ended, looking at the yellow curtains on the window above the sink. She was staying. Not permanently, not forever, but for now. She was staying in the house on Sycamore Lane in Byers Creek, Indiana, in the town she'd left at 17 with more relief than she'd expected, in the house that smelled like cedar and her mother's soap and the clean, sharp air of the basement she'd been forbidden from entering her entire life. She was staying because there was work to do and because the work deserved to be done properly, and because the alternative, going back to the apartment on Thurber Drive, and the school, and the routine that had been barely holding 3 weeks ago, felt less like returning than retreating. The house was hers. It had no mortgage and $9,000 in a savings account, and a basement worth $9.6 million, and a sewing room with 2 pieces of someone's clothing left unfinished on the work table. It was more home than she'd had in years, and she had not known until she stood in it that this was true. Word moved through Byers Creek the way Beverly had said word moved through Byers Creek. Not by traveling, simply by arriving. By the following Tuesday, Claire at the Mercantile knew. By Thursday, Elena Marchetti called and asked if she could come by. She came on a Saturday morning with her daughter Rosa, who had driven down from Indianapolis for the weekend and who had her mother's blue eyes and a quieter manner. They sat in the living room and Nora told them about the collection, the general shape of it, the 21 years, the estimated value. Elena listened without expression. When Nora finished, Elena was quiet for a moment. She built all of that, Elena said. It was not quite a question. In the basement. Downstairs. For 21 years. Starting from the box of unclaimed pieces Gerald Thatcher gave her when the shop closed. Elena looked at her hands. I knew she was working on something. I told you I knew. But I thought it was maybe a few nice things put away. Something practical. She paused. $7 to $9 million is not a few nice things put away. No, Nora agreed. Can I see it? Elena asked. The room. They went downstairs, the 3 of them, and stood at the bottom of the stairs in the even overhead light. Rosa made a sound that was not quite a word. Elena stood at the center of the room and turned slowly, the way Vale had turned on his first morning there, taking the whole thing in before moving to any part of it. Then she walked to the first shelving unit and leaned in close to read one of the handwritten labels. Gold, yellow, size 7. Art Deco, circa 1928. Diamond center stone, old European cut, approximately 0.8 carats. She read a second label. A third. She wrote all of these herself, Elena said. Every one. Elena straightened and looked around the room one more time. She didn't speak for a while. I want to tell you something, she finally said. Your mother came to my door 6 months after I lost the brooch. The shop had just moved, and I'd been back and been told it was gone, and I was not well about it. I had not told my daughter or anyone. I was just carrying it. She looked at Nora. Your mother knocked on my door and said she wanted to check in. I don't know how she knew. She just knew things about the people around her, what they needed and when. We had tea. She didn't mention the brooch. She didn't say anything in particular. She just sat with me for an hour and then left. And when she left, I felt better, which I would not have predicted before she arrived. Rosa put her hand on Elena's arm. I didn't know until you came to my door last week what she had been carrying the whole time, Elena said. She knew where the brooch was. She was working on how to return it. And she came to sit with me in the meantime, while she figured it out, without saying any of that. She shook her head slowly. That is an extremely particular kind of person. Yes, Nora said. It is. The formal process of transferring the collection began in the third week of May, when the Chicago auction house Vail had recommended sent 2 specialists to Byers Creek. They arrived in a van and spent 2 days in the basement with their own equipment and their own documentation, cross-referencing Vail's assessment against their own, photographing each piece under multiple light conditions, taking condition notes in their own format. They confirmed Vail's estimates and raised the projection slightly on 3 pieces, including the parure, where the Harrington provenance letter had now been authenticated by 2 independent document specialists Vail had arranged. The parure's new estimate was between $750,000 and $1,050,000. The auction house's representative, a woman named Patricia Chun who had the same quality of unhurried precision as Vail, told Nora that the correct approach was to move the collection's most significant pieces through New York auction in the fall, where the major collectors would be present and competitive, and to move the remainder through smaller sales over the following year. She projected a total realized value in the range of $8,200,000 to $9,400,000. She said she had worked with many estate collections over her career. She said she had never seen documentation of this quality from a private individual. She asked, with genuine curiosity rather than professional flattery, how Delia had known to do it this way. She worked in a jewelry shop for 22 years, Nora said. And then she kept going. Patricia Chin nodded. Most people, she said, would have kept a few nice pieces in a drawer and sold the rest at an estate sale. My mother wasn't most people. No, she was not. The Annabelle Harrington letter took longer to resolve than everything else. Pruitt engaged a genealogist to search for living Harrington descendants, a process that took 2 months. The search found 3, a great-niece in Cincinnati, a second cousin once removed in Phoenix, and a man in his 70s named Edward Harrington in Portland, Oregon, who turned out to be a nephew of James and Annabelle's son Harold, who had not died in Korea as Nora had initially understood, but had survived and fathered a child before dying in a car accident in 1958, the same year Annabelle died. Edward Harrington had never known his grandmother. He had been born in 1956, 2 years before Annabelle died, and Harold had not been in contact with his parents in the years before his accident. He knew his grandparents had existed. He had no photographs of them. Pruitt coordinated the correspondence. Nora sent Edward Harrington a copy of Annabelle's letter and a copy of James Harrington's provenance document, along with photographs of the watch and the ring. She also sent the ring itself, because it had not been part of her mother's collection. It had been in the case when Delia found it, and her mother had kept it as part of the Harrington documentation, but it was a wedding ring, and its place was with the family, if any could be found. Edward Harrington called her 3 weeks after receiving the package. He was a quiet man, a retired civil engineer, and he talked for a long time about reading his grandmother's letter for the first time. He said he'd read it in the kitchen in the evening and had not been able to say anything to his wife for a while afterward. She sounds like she was a real person, he said, which Nora understood to mean. She sounds like she was more than a name on a genealogy chart. She was, Nora said. Everything she left behind suggests someone who paid close attention to the people around her. He asked about the watch. Nora explained that it was part of the estate collection being transferred through auction. He said he understood and that he didn't have any claim on it, that he simply wanted to know it existed and where it had come from. She decided, after the call, that the watch should go to Edward Harrington, not to auction. The parure was one thing, a piece of jewelry whose place was in the hands of someone who recognized and valued it, which in this case meant a collector or a museum rather than a family that had never known it. But the watch was something else. It had been James Harrington's everyday object, the thing he checked at intervals throughout the day, the thing his wife had given him on the morning they were married. A man's personal watch should be with his family if his family could be found. She had Vail examine it one more time and create a full condition report, and she had it professionally cleaned and regulated. She sent it to Portland in a padded case with the condition report and a copy of Delia's acquisition record from the 2007 notebook. She did not expect anything in return. It was simply the correct thing to do, which she understood now was the standard her mother had applied to everything she'd built downstairs. She found the dress in the third week of May. She'd been working through the sewing room systematically, cataloging the contents for estate purposes, and she'd started with the supplies on the shelves and worked toward the work table. The two unfinished pieces of customer work were still there, the wool trousers with the half-pinned hem and the jacket with the stopped zipper. She set them aside to call the customers. In the project bin below the work table, under both pieces of customer work, was a third garment. She lifted it out. It was a dress. Linen, cut in a style that was neither old-fashioned nor particularly trendy, the kind of cut that would simply be right for years without needing any revision. The color was a particular dark blue, not navy, not indigo, something between them, the color of deep water in late afternoon light. The major seams were sewn and pressed. The sleeves were set and finished. The bodice had all its closures. The hem was pinned but not sewn, held in place with Delia's precise glass head pins at equal intervals all the way around. A note was pinned to the front of the bodice in her mother's handwriting, the letters shakier than the notebook entries, consistent with the last months of the illness. For when you're ready for something new. Nora stood in the sewing room for a long time. The dress was her size, exactly. Not the size she'd been at 25 or the size she'd been during the difficult years of the marriage, but the size she was now. Her mother had known, had looked at her at some point, or had held the measurements in her memory from years of being the woman who altered other people's clothes and understood bodies and fit in the way that only someone with a lifetime of that work could understand, and had cut the fabric accordingly. She had not been making it for the person Nora had been. She had been making it for the person Nora was now. Nora sat down on the stool at the work table and held the dress across her lap and cried. Not the way you cry at a funeral, which is often as much about the public nature of the occasion as about the grief itself. The way you cry when you are alone in a room, and the thing that breaks you open is not the large formal loss, but a small specific evidence that someone who was supposed to know you did, in fact, know you, and thought about you, and kept thinking about you until they ran out of time to keep going. She sat there for a while, and then she set the dress down carefully on the work table, away from the pinned hem, so the pins wouldn't be disturbed, and she blew her nose and washed her face at the bathroom sink and went back to the kitchen. She had work to do. There was always work to do. In the months that followed, as the spring turned into a summer she hadn't expected to spend in Byers Creek, Nora learned things about her mother that she hadn't known and things about herself that she'd been moving away from for years and needed to move back toward. She learned that Delia had been, for the last 15 years of her working life, the informal consultant for estate executors in 3 counties who called her when they didn't know what something was worth. She had never charged for this. She had simply given correct information to people who needed correct information. Several of those executors called Nora when they heard what she was dealing with, and the calls were all a version of the same thing. Your mother helped me. I don't know if she ever told you. I thought you should know. She learned that the woman at the post office had been holding Delia's mail for 8 months rather than the usual 2 weeks because Delia had explained the situation before she died and asked her to, and the woman had agreed without being asked twice. She learned that 6 members of St. Catherine's had quietly covered Delia's pew offering for the last year of her life, when Delia was no longer able to get to Mass and could not have made the payment herself. None of them had told anyone. When word reached Claire at the Mercantile, Claire called Nora directly and said, I want you to know that your mother used to come in here on the 1st of every month and buy whatever was in the clearance basket at the back, without looking at it first. Just whatever was there. I asked her once why she did that, and she said, well, someone marked it down, and it's better if it sells than if it doesn't. I've been thinking about that ever since I heard what was in that basement. She could have bought the whole store if she'd wanted to. When word reached Father Bowen at St. Catherine's, he stopped Nora after the 11 o'clock Mass one Sunday and told her that Delia had been anonymously funding the parish's food assistance program for 14 years through a contribution that arrived by mail the first week of every January in an envelope with no return address. He'd suspected it was her for the last 5 years, based on the postmark, but had never asked because she had clearly not wanted him to ask. When word reached the estate executor in Greenfield who had called Delia for guidance in 2009, he called Nora and said, she charged me nothing, spent 3 hours on the phone with me, and saved me from seriously undervaluing a collection worth 4 times what I thought it was. I don't know how she knew what she knew. I knew she worked at the jewelry shop. I didn't know the rest. None of them had known the rest. That was what it meant to be Delia Montoya on Sycamore Lane in Byers Creek, Indiana. to know more than you said, and to give more than you advertised, and to build more than anyone could see, and to do it without once pointing at yourself and saying, "Look at what I made." She found the first-grade reading certificate in the shoebox and understood that her mother had kept it for 40 years not because she was a sentimental woman. She was not, but because Nora's name was on it. Every piece of paper with Nora's name on it was in that box. Her college graduation program, a newspaper clipping from a Franklin Middle School feature about the art department, a printed email from a student's parent, forwarded to Delia by someone who must have known her somehow, saying that Nora's class had changed the way their child thought about drawing. Every piece of paper with Nora's name on it, for 40 years, in a shoebox in the back of a closet. The first auction results came in September from New York. The Lalique brooch, the parure, and 7 of the most significant watches sold at the fall session of the major house Vail had recommended, placed with buyers in 3 different countries. The realized total from those 12 pieces alone was $4,260,000 against an estimate of $3,500,000 to $4,800,000. Nora sat in the kitchen with the phone in her hand after Pruitt called with the numbers and looked at the yellow curtains on the window above the sink. For $1,260,000. From 12 pieces. Out of 863. She put the phone down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she went to the sewing room. She'd had the Bernina machine serviced in July by a technician from Indianapolis, the same one Delia had apparently used for 15 years. He declared it in excellent working order and had been visibly moved by the condition of it, by the care evident in every part of the machine's maintenance. She had told him she was going to keep it, and he'd nodded as if this was the correct decision. She sat at the machine and pulled the dark blue dress from the shelf where she'd hung it on a padded hanger in June, waiting. She spread the hem across the machine surface and looked at her mother's pins, each one placed at exactly the spacing she'd always used. She had taken exactly 1 sewing class in her adult life, an 8-week evening course at a community center in Columbus in her early 30s, when she thought it might be something she and Kevin could do together. He hadn't come to any of the sessions. She'd gotten as far as a simple pair of curtains before the class ended, and she'd never sewn anything since. This was different from curtains. But she had the pins to follow, and she had the machine in front of her, and she had her mother's pegboard wall of organized thread behind her, and she had the particular kind of intention that comes from not being able to leave something unfinished when finishing it is within your reach. She chose the correct thread from the organized spools and wound the bobbin and threaded the needle the way the community center instructor had taught her, then the machine's own threading guide for the rest. She ran a test seam on a scrap of the same linen from the project bin. The tension was correct. She started at the back seam of the hem and worked around. The stitching was not her mother's stitching. She could see the difference herself. Delia's work elsewhere on the dress was invisible in the way that the best sewing is invisible, the seams becoming part of the fabric rather than sitting on top of it. What Nora produced working around the hem at the machine was correct. It was straight and the tension held, and the thread matched the fabric. But it was the work of someone who was doing her best with what she had rather than the work of someone for whom this had been the practice of a lifetime. It was enough. She took the dress off the machine and pressed the hem with the iron from the shelf, using the press cloth her mother had kept draped over the ironing board in the corner, and she held the dress up to the window light to check. The hem was finished. The dress was done. She would wear it, she decided. Not for any particular occasion. Just on an ordinary day. In the ordinary life she was building in this house in this town she hadn't expected to come back to. She would wear it to the post office and to Claire's store and to St. Catherine's, where she'd started going on Sunday mornings in June because the building was familiar and the hour was quiet, and it seemed like the kind of continuation her mother would have recognized. She thought about the notebook entry from 2013, the Whitfield ring. I bought it because when I held it up to the window in the Whitfield living room and the stones caught the light, I felt something I don't often feel, which was a wish that I had someone to show it to. She had that feeling now, standing at the window with the finished dress in her hands. She wished she had someone to show it to. She wished she could walk into the kitchen and say, "Look, you finished it." She wished 100 things she did not have words for, and that she had the sense to know were not going to resolve into words anytime soon. She kept the Whitfield ring. It had been in the glass front case in the basement with everything else, cataloged and photographed by Vail and by Patricia Chen's team from the Chicago house. When the smaller pieces went to the regional auction in October, she'd asked Pruitt to remove the Whitfield ring from the consignment list. She wore it on her right hand now. The stones caught the light in the particular old-fashioned way of old European cut diamonds, not the single burst of modern stones, but something more complex, more varied, as if each facet had its own opinion about what to do with light and was expressing it independently. She held her hand up to the kitchen window on mornings when the sun came through the yellow curtains at the right angle, and she watched it and thought about her mother watching the same thing in the Whitfield family's living room in April of 2013 and feeling the same thing and writing it down. She hung the dress on the padded hanger and went downstairs to the basement. The collection was mostly gone now, cataloged and transferred to the auction houses in stages, each piece leaving with its documentation in order. What remained in the glass front cases were the pieces still awaiting placement, smaller items and less significant ones, things that would go through the smaller sales over the coming months. The room was lighter than it had been, more space between the remaining pieces, the velvet showing where the filled slots had been emptied. She stood at the center of the room and looked at what remained. Her mother had spent 21 years filling this room one piece at a time, building something she couldn't directly say, finding a form for love that had no direct language. She had documented everything because she understood that documentation was the difference between a thing existing and a thing being known. She had kept records of where each piece came from because she believed that the history of an object was not separate from the object itself, that what you held in your hand when you held a ring or a watch or a brooch was not simply the material of it, but everything that had passed through it. She had spent a lifetime returning things to the people they belonged to. The brooch to Elena Marchetti, eventually. The watch to Edward Harrington. All the pieces she'd bought at estate sales, returned in the form of fair prices paid rather than pennies taken, given back to the world through the collectors and museums and buyers who would hold them next. Her mother had understood that. Nothing she was keeping was truly hers. She was holding things in trust until the right hands could be found. And she had spent 21 years holding something for Nora, until Nora's hands were ready to receive it. That fall, when the leaves came back to the maple tree in the front yard and the air turned cold again, Nora planted the flower beds. She bought pansies from the garden center on Route 40, purple and yellow in equal numbers, the same combination Delia had put in every spring. She dug the beds along the porch in the early morning before the day got warm, her hands in the soil, setting each plant in its hole with the care of someone doing a thing they intend to keep doing. Beverly watched from the porch next door with a mug of coffee and said nothing for a while. She would have done those in April, Beverly said eventually. I know, Nora said. I'm a few months behind. She never got them in the ground by May Day, said April was the right month and that anything after was late. Then I'm late. Yes, Beverly said. But they're in. The last thing Nora did that day was go to the basement and turn off the overhead lights. She stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, looking down at the darkroom. The climate control unit hummed at its constant frequency, still running, maintaining the temperature and humidity for the pieces that remained. The glass front cases caught the faint light from the stairwell and gave nothing back. She understood something now that she hadn't understood at the beginning of May, standing in a parking lot in Columbus, deciding whether $9 in laundry detergent was a reasonable expenditure. She understood that her mother had not been withholding from her. She had been building toward her, for as long as she'd been building anything. The basement was not a secret kept against Nora. It was a secret kept for her, against the day when it could be given whole and documented and free of any complication. Delia had been afraid, she thought, of the half-given thing, of handing Nora something incomplete and watching the incompleteness become a problem. She'd had that fear about everything. The explanations that never quite arrived, the conversations that went right up to the edge of what needed to be said and then stopped. She had wanted to give Nora the thing complete. She had spent 21 years working toward completion. She had run out of time while still working. That was the thing Nora was going to have to make her peace with. Not the distance, which was explicable now and had always been more complicated than simple coldness. Not the silence, which had been filled, it turned out, with notebooks and dress patterns and a shoebox with her name on it. The thing she was going to have to live with was the timing. The 21 years of building and the 14 months of illness and the 8 months of silence after the August phone call, all of it adding up to a woman who died 1 month short of being ready to say out loud what she had been saying in every other available form for most of Nora's adult life. The pansies along the porch survived the fall and went into dormancy in November the way pansies do, waiting under a light mulch for April to bring them back. Beverly said they'd bloom again in spring without any help, which Nora had not known because she'd never grown anything before and had always meant to. She bought a Bernina threading guide and a beginner's sewing reference book from the fabric store in Fort Wayne and spent Sunday afternoons at the machine in the sewing room learning what she'd always had access to and never asked about. The reference book had been written for someone who knew nothing, which was approximately right. She made mistakes and corrected them and made the same mistake again and eventually didn't. She finished the hem on Joyce Ketterman's wool trousers and returned them, and when Joyce Ketterman saw them, she said they were exactly right, and Nora thought, yes, that's the standard. She flipped the switch. The basement went dark. Then she closed the door and did not put the padlock on it, and went to make dinner in her mother's kitchen, in the house she was learning to call her own. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.